How can a player be valuable enough to help secure a $2 billion media deal, but somehow not valuable enough to make a 12-player roster? That's not a hot take. That's the contradiction sitting at the center of women's basketball right now. And the timing makes it impossible to ignore. Because the ink had barely dried on the historic media rights agreement between the WNBA and NBC before fans started connecting that league leadership clearly hoped would never be connected. On one side, celebration. Headlines about growth. Billion-dollar valuations. A new era. On the other side, a fresh memory that still hadn't faded. Caitlin Clark left off the Olympic roster. Individually, those two events might be manageable. Together, they form a question that refuses to go away. The league just entered the most financially significant phase in its history. A $2.2 billion commitment signals belief, expansion, long-term investment, and global ambition. Networks don't gamble that kind of money without running projections. They don't spend billions on nostalgia. They invest in momentum. They invest in growth curves. They invest in attention. And right now, there is one undeniable engine of attention in this league. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring fans. She brought a shift. Sold-out arenas in opposing cities. Broadcast schedule changes to accommodate demand. Regular season games pulling numbers that used to be reserved for championship moments. Ticket prices surging. Jersey sales spiking. Debate dominating sports talk across platforms that historically ignored women's basketball entirely. That kind of impact doesn't stay invisible in a boardroom. So when NBC committed billions to the future of the league, the subtext was loud. They weren't buying yesterday. They were buying what's happening right now. And what's happening right now has a face. A number 22 jersey. A style of play that stretches defenses to half court and pulls viewers in from across demographics the league had struggled to reach for decades. Now place that next to the Olympic decision. When Team USA finalized its roster, the explanation felt clean. Experience. Chemistry. Veteran leadership. The Olympics aren't for rookies. That was the line. Structured. Professional. Safe. But here's the problem. The same league that argued she wasn't ready for the international stage just signed a deal that essentially positions her era as the financial foundation of its future. You can't separate those timelines. You can't say a player isn't prepared for global representation while simultaneously benefiting from the global audience she is already attracting. And that's where the tension begins to feel bigger than basketball. Because this isn't just about one roster decision. It's about power. It's about control. It's about who decides when the torch gets passed. The veterans who built the structure or the market forces reshaping it in real time. For years, the hierarchy in women's basketball felt stable. Earn your spot. Respect the veterans. Wait your turn. The system worked because the growth curve was steady, predictable, manageable. But then something happened that doesn't follow traditional sports timelines. A rookie didn't just enter the league. A phenomenon did. And phenomena don't wait politely. They disrupt schedules. They disrupt marketing plans. They disrupt locker room dynamics. They disrupt narratives that took decades to construct. They make executives accelerate plans. They force coaches to answer uncomfortable questions. They create fan bases that don't care about history lessons. They care about what they're seeing right now. That kind of shift can feel threatening. Because when the money starts following one player, when casual viewers start identifying the sport through one name, when social media engagement spikes around one style of play, it changes leverage. And leverage is something established systems rarely surrender easily. So when the Olympic roster came out without Clark's name on it, it wasn't just a basketball headline. It was interpreted as a message. Wait your turn. Earn it the hard way. Respect the hierarchy. But then the NBC deal dropped. And suddenly, the message felt inconsistent. If she's not ready to represent the country, how is she ready to represent the financial future of the league? If chemistry matters more than star power, why are networks investing in star power? If experience outweighs spectacle, why is spectacle driving the revenue model? These aren't emotional questions. They're structural ones. Fans noticed immediately. Social media exploded. Not because Team USA isn't stacked with talent. It absolutely is. Not because veterans don't deserve respect. They absolutely do. The backlash grew because the two narratives collided at the worst possible time. One narrative said, "She's not essential." The other narrative said, "She's transformational." Both cannot be true at the same time. And that contradiction is what makes this moment different from previous controversies in the league. This isn't just sports debate. It's business logic clashing with basketball philosophy. It's a billion-dollar vote of confidence colliding with a coaching decision that feels rooted in tradition. Some will argue the two are unrelated. That media rights deals take years to negotiate. That Olympic selections are about fit, not fame. That correlation doesn't equal causation. But perception matters. And perception right now is that the market has already decided who the centerpiece of this era is, even if certain power structures aren't ready to publicly acknowledge it. That's why this story isn't fading. Because every time the $2.2 billion figure gets mentioned, the roster omission gets mentioned with it. Every time ratings spike, someone brings up the Olympic debate. Every time Clark drops another high-volume performance, the question resurfaces. Was this really about basketball? Or was it about maintaining order? Because here's what makes it even more complicated. Team USA didn't lose. They didn't fail. They didn't collapse under pressure. They won. Dominant as always. Gold secured. And yet, the conversation never fully centered on the victory. It centered on who wasn't there. That shadow doesn't appear by accident. It appears when cultural momentum and institutional decisions fall out of sync. The NBC deal didn't create the controversy. It magnified it. It turned a sports debate into an economic debate. It transformed a roster choice into a referendum on who truly drives modern women's basketball. And that's the tension we're going to unpack, not from a place of outrage, but from a place of analysis. Because beneath the noise, beneath the viral clips and comment section wars, there's a deeper shift happening. A shift in power. A shift in leverage. A shift in who holds the real influence over the future of the sport. The question isn't whether the Olympic team was talented enough. The question is whether the system is prepared for what happens when a single player accelerates the timeline faster than leadership anticipated. Because when billions of dollars align with one name, ignoring that name stops looking strategic. It starts looking personal. And once that perception takes hold, it's very hard to control the narrative again. This isn't just about Caitlin Clark. It's about what happens when the market speaks louder than tradition. And what that means for everyone involved moving forward. The most damaging part of this entire situation isn't the decision itself. It's the order in which everything happened. If the NBC deal had come first, followed months later by a quiet Olympic roster debate, the backlash might have been manageable. If the Olympic roster had been finalized years before Clark ever entered the league, the explanation would have felt consistent. But that's not how this unfolded. First came the snub. The justification was polished, measured, professional. The Olympic stage demands experience. Chemistry matters. There are veterans who've earned their place. It's not about hype. It's about fit. That messaging held for a moment. Then the numbers kept climbing. Indiana Fever games started pulling viewership figures that felt disconnected from what the league had historically experienced. Broadcast schedules shifted. Prime-time slots expanded. Ticket resale markets exploded in cities that previously struggled to fill lower bowls. Social engagement metrics spiked whenever number 22 stepped onto a floor. And then, almost as if the business side couldn't ignore it anymore, the announcement dropped. A $2.2 billion media rights deal. Not a modest increase. Not a cautious extension. A massive, era-defining commitment. And suddenly, the timeline became impossible to defend. Because while the Olympic Committee was explaining why Clark wasn't one of the 12 most necessary players for Team USA, the league itself was benefiting from a financial revolution closely tied to her presence. The contradiction sharpened overnight. You can't tell fans that a player isn't critical enough for a roster while the league's valuation is surging during her rookie season. You can't preach patience while networks are accelerating long-term investment plans. The timing made the basketball explanation feel incomplete. And fans are not passive observers anymore. This isn't 2004. It isn't even 2016. Modern sports audiences track metrics. They screenshot ratings. They compare attendance charts. They follow endorsement deals. They understand market influence. So when Clark's games consistently outperformed expectations and then the NBC deal formalized the league's financial leap, the conclusion many reached wasn't subtle. The market has already chosen its centerpiece, which makes the Olympic decision feel less like strategy and more like resistance. That's where frustration began to turn into something stronger. Because the Olympic roster announcement wasn't framed as temporary. It wasn't positioned as development. It was definitive. Not this time. Not yet. Not ready. Those phrases land differently when, at the same time, your league is publicly benefiting from the attention that player generates. And it wasn't just casual fans noticing. Sports media panels began drawing side-by-side comparisons. On one screen, Olympic highlights. On the other, Clark draining logo range threes in front of sold-out crowds. Headlines started blending business and basketball into the same conversation. It stopped being about 12 roster spots. It became about messaging. What exactly is the league trying to communicate? Because if the official stance is that experience and veteran hierarchy dictate opportunity, that's understandable. Sports have traditions. But if the business trajectory is being propelled by a new audience drawn in primarily by one player, then ignoring that dynamic feels strategically risky. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. The Olympic team didn't just exist independently of Clark's momentum. It actively competed with it for attention. During the Olympic stretch, viewership comparisons started circulating. Clips of Fever regular season matchups began trending alongside international highlights. Debate threads exploded with one recurring question. If this player is driving record-breaking domestic engagement, how does she not fit into the league's biggest global showcase? That question doesn't disappear easily. Because even if the Olympic Committee operated with pure basketball intent, the optics made it look like a disconnect between the business brain and the competitive brain of the sport. One side was cashing checks. The other side was drawing boundaries. And boundaries don't hold long when momentum is accelerating. The timeline amplified everything. It made neutral observers skeptical. It made casual fans defensive. It made longtime followers uneasy. Because it felt like the league was simultaneously celebrating growth while downplaying the catalyst behind that growth. That's a dangerous combination. When perception starts to tilt toward internal resistance rather than strategic patience, trust erodes. And once fans begin believing that a system is resisting change instead of managing it, every decision afterward gets scrutinized under that lens. The Olympic roster became symbolic. Not just of selection criteria, but of generational tension. The NBC deal symbolized belief in the future. The roster decision symbolized loyalty to the past. And when those two symbols collided within the same news cycle, it didn't just create debate. It created doubt. Doubt about alignment. Doubt about leadership cohesion. Doubt about whether the people making basketball decisions are in sync with the economic reality unfolding around them. That's why the timing matters more than anything. It exposed a gap. A gap between growth and governance. Between spectacle and structure. Between where the sport is headed and who gets to decide the pace of that movement. And once that gap became visible, it stopped being a one-week controversy. It became a storyline that keeps resurfacing every time Clark steps onto the court. Because every dominant performance feels like a reminder. Every ratings surge feels like evidence. Every sold-out arena feels like confirmation. The timeline didn't just make the snub controversial. It made it look outdated. And in a sports landscape that moves at social media speed, outdated decisions don't just fade quietly. They get replayed, reanalyzed, reframed, over and over again. That's what turned a roster omission into a billion-dollar contradiction. And the deeper you examine it, the harder it becomes to separate coincidence from pattern. The tension didn't start with the Olympic roster. It started the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into the league and the entire ecosystem shifted around her. Because for decades, the WNBA operated within a specific rhythm. Growth was steady but gradual. Media coverage was earned through longevity. Respect was accumulated season by season. Veterans built the foundation brick by brick: overseas contracts, commercial flights, modest crowds, limited endorsement opportunities. There was pride in that grind. And then, almost overnight, the spotlight intensified in a way the league had never experienced. Clark entered with a national fanbase already attached. A massive college following transition directly into professional arenas. Her jersey sales surged before she even played a full slate of games. Endorsement deals followed immediately. Security details became necessary. Media attention multiplied. That kind of entrance changes dynamics. Not because it's unfair, but because it's different. When someone arrives with momentum that bypasses the traditional waiting period, the existing hierarchy feels pressure. Not necessarily hostility, but pressure. The old rules suddenly feel negotiable. The timeline feels accelerated. The usual earn-your-turn pathway feels disrupted. And sports cultures, especially ones built on long-term sacrifice, do not always embrace disruption easily. You could see subtle signs of that tension early. Comments about new fans not understanding the history of the game. Suggestions that hype doesn't equal greatness. Emphasis on fundamentals over flash. Reminders that the league existed long before any single player arrived. Individually, those comments aren't controversial. They're protective. They're natural. Veterans defending what they built. But in aggregate, they began to feel dismissive. Because the new wave of fans wasn't trying to erase history. They were responding to what they saw: a player launching shots from distances rarely attempted in women's basketball, threading passes through impossible angles, playing with a tempo that felt different from what they were used to watching. Clark didn't just bring numbers. She brought style. And style is cultural currency. The established guard values execution, defensive discipline, structure. Cheryl Reeve, in particular, is known for system control, precision, reliability, controlled pace, championship fundamentals. Clark represents volatility. She takes risks. She turns the ball over. She attempts passes that could either break a defense or land in the third row. She shoots from the logo without hesitation. She plays fast, aggressively, fearlessly. That style excites viewers. But it doesn't always align with conservative team philosophy. So the tension wasn't personal at first. It was philosophical. Old-school structure versus new-era spectacle. The problem is that spectacle, in today's sports economy, often drives the financial engine. That's where things start to feel uncomfortable. Because if the style that excites new audiences doesn't align with the coaching philosophy that built the league, something has to give. The veterans didn't ask for that conflict. They earned their space. They endured seasons where cameras barely showed up. They carried the league through financially uncertain years. They fought for charter flights, improved facilities, better contracts. Their loyalty to tradition isn't stubbornness, it's survival instinct. But Clark's arrival forced a new question. What happens when survival transitions into expansion? Because expansion doesn't wait for consensus. It moves where the attention flows. And attention flowed rapidly toward one player. This is where the phenomenon label becomes important. A star grows within a system. A phenomenon shifts the system. Clark didn't just perform well. She altered television programming. She influenced arena logistics. She expanded demographic reach. She triggered debates across sports shows that previously ignored the WNBA entirely. That's disruptive power. And disruption creates friction even when no one intends for it to. Inside locker rooms, dynamics change. Media questions shift focus. Press conferences begin centering around one name repeatedly. Veteran accomplishments risk being overshadowed by rookie storylines. It's human to feel unsettled by that. The league's foundational players weren't wrong to expect acknowledgement of their contributions. But the market doesn't operate on sentiment. It operates on momentum. When the Olympic Committee made its decision, it may have been rooted in basketball ideology, experience, trust, familiarity. But to fans observing the broader context, it felt like hierarchy reasserting control. Like a message saying, the system still decides. The irony is that the system was already being reshaped externally by media contracts and fan engagement metrics. So what looked internally like a standard veteran preference felt externally like resistance to evolution. And that perception gap widened quickly. Because the new fans Clark brought in don't view the league through decades of historical context. They entered during the acceleration phase. They associate growth with her presence. They link excitement to her style. When they heard dismissive tones about understanding the game or earning respect, some interpreted it as gatekeeping. Maybe that wasn't the intention. But perception, again, is everything. The old guard sees protection. The new audience sees exclusion. And that's how philosophical disagreement turns into cultural tension. The Olympic roster decision didn't create this divide. It revealed it. It exposed the fault line between tradition and transformation. Between preserving legacy and embracing momentum. Between structured control and unpredictable spectacle. And once that fault line became visible, every comment, every interview, every performance started being filtered through it. Fans began watching not just for basketball, but for signs of alignment or resistance. Because when a phenomenon collides with an established order, the question isn't whether tension will exist. The question is who adapts first. And right now, adaptation feels uneven. That's what keeps this story alive. It's not about disrespecting veterans. It's about whether the league can reconcile gratitude for its past with enthusiasm for its future. Because the phenomenon isn't slowing down. And the longer the philosophical gap remains visible, the more it feels like two eras competing instead of collaborating. That's the real friction. Not personal. Not petty. Structural. And structural tension doesn't disappear quietly. The word that kept getting repeated after the roster announcement was simple. Chemistry. It sounds responsible, mature, strategic. Coaches love it because it's difficult to argue against. Chemistry suggests balance. It suggests harmony. It suggests a team greater than the sum of its parts. But when you slow the argument down and examine it closely, cracks start to appear. Olympic teams do not have the luxury of year-long development cycles. They don't build cohesion across multiple seasons. They don't grind through 82 game schedules together. They assemble quickly. They practice for a short window. They rely on elite talent to adjust rapidly. That's the nature of international tournaments. So the idea that one of the most dynamic passers in the league couldn't adapt within that framework feels questionable. Especially when the roster is filled with all-stars and MVPs capable of adjusting to nearly any style. Because here's the reality. Elite players don't struggle to play with other elite players. They figure it out. The 1992 Dream Team didn't debate whether stars could coexist. They leaned into it. They understood that spectacle fuels growth. That bringing generational talent together amplifies interest globally. The Olympic stage isn't just about winning. It's about showcasing. And when you remove the most talked about young star in the sport from that showcase, you're not just making a strategic choice. You're narrowing the spectacle. That's where the chemistry defense begins to feel less persuasive. Because chemistry and talent are not mutually exclusive. If anything, talent accelerates chemistry. Elite basketball IQ speeds up adaptation. And Clark's strengths, court vision, floor spacing, range, would have complemented the roster's interior dominance beautifully. Imagine her passing lanes opening space for Aya Wilson. Imagine defenders forced to extend coverage to half court, creating driving lanes for Breanna Stewart. Imagine transition play evolving into a faster tempo that keeps opponents scrambling. That isn't fantasy. That's basketball geometry. So when chemistry was presented as the primary barrier, fans began asking an uncomfortable question. Was chemistry the real concern? Or was control? Because Clark's style is unpredictable. She plays with calculated chaos. She attempts high-risk passes. She launches deep shots early in the clock. She pushes tempo relentlessly. She thrives in moments that feel slightly out of system. For a coach who prioritizes discipline and structure, that volatility can feel risky. It's easier to manage reliability than spontaneity. But spontaneity is what captivates modern audiences. NBC didn't invest billions in predictability. They invested in engagement. The chemistry argument begins to unravel when you consider how little disruption would actually be required. Clark wouldn't need to dominate minutes. She wouldn't need to hijack the offense. Her presence alone would shift defensive schemes. Her gravity stretches coverage. That spacing benefits everyone. And here's where the debate intensifies. The Olympics were already likely a gold medal run. Team USA's depth is unmatched. They were heavy favorites, which makes the conservative approach even more puzzling. When you are overwhelmingly favored, that's when you experiment. That's when you showcase. That's when you lean into the global moment. Instead, the decision leaned toward safety. Safety wins games. Spectacle grows sports. Those aren't always the same objective. And when the NBC deal dropped, emphasizing long-term expansion and global reach, the Olympic strategy began to look misaligned with the league's business direction. Because global audiences are drawn to narrative. They tune in for dominance, yes, but they stay for personalities, rivalries, flair, uniqueness. Clark represents a stylistic evolution. Deeper range, faster tempo, risk tolerance, modern shot selection. That's aligned with how younger audiences consume basketball today. By framing the decision purely around chemistry, leadership may have underestimated how differently modern fans interpret that word. Chemistry to a coach means cohesion. Chemistry to a fan means excitement. If the Olympic team system looked efficient but predictable, while Clark's league performances looked electric and volatile, comparisons were inevitable. And those comparisons weren't flattering. Because it started to feel like the Olympic roster represented the past decade of women's basketball, while Clark represented the next one. That perception, fair or not, carries weight. The chemistry defense also falters when you consider how frequently Olympic teams adjust on the fly. Rotations shift. Roles evolve. New lineups emerge mid-tournament. Adaptability is baked into the format. So arguing that one additional high IQ player would disrupt cohesion stretches credibility. Which leaves a lingering suspicion. Was this about fit? Or about preserving hierarchy? Because chemistry can sometimes be code for comfort. Comfort with veterans. Comfort with known patterns. Comfort with predictability. And Clark is not predictable. She is momentum-driven. She is crowd-responsive. She is high variance. For some coaches, that unpredictability feels like unnecessary risk on a global stage. But for broadcasters and business executives, unpredictability is gold. Unpredictability keeps viewers watching. It drives engagement spikes. It produces viral moments. And in today's sports economy, viral moments translate into sustained interest. The chemistry explanation might satisfy traditional basketball logic. But it struggles to align with the broader economic logic currently shaping the league. That misalignment is why the debate persists. Because if chemistry was truly the deciding factor, it would imply that Clark's skill set is incompatible with elite team basketball. And that's a hard claim to defend when her passing vision consistently elevates teammates at the professional level. The truth likely sits somewhere between strategy and philosophy. But perception often matters more than nuance. To many fans, chemistry felt like a shield. A way to justify maintaining order. A way to avoid handing the spotlight to a rookie. A way to prioritize structure over spectacle. And once that perception formed, the NBC deal poured gasoline on it. Because now the argument wasn't just about basketball synergy. It was about whether leadership underestimated how much the sport's identity is shifting. Chemistry wins gold medals. But cultural chemistry, between league and audience, wins growth. And right now, that second form of chemistry feels far more fragile. That's why the explanation doesn't settle the debate. It fuels it. Sometimes the loudest moment in a controversy isn't a fiery statement. It's a subtle admission. For weeks, the Olympic decision stood firm. The messaging was unified. Experience mattered. Roles were defined. The roster was final. There was no room for debate. Then something shifted. After watching Clark continue to perform at a high level during the WNBA season, after seeing the attention refuse to cool off, after feeling the public pressure build, a different tone entered the conversation. Dawn Staley, one of the most respected figures in the sport and a member of the selection committee, made a comment that landed heavier than many realized. She acknowledged that if the decision were being made again, Clark would be in the conversation. That sentence did more damage to the original defense than any viral tweet ever could. Because it wasn't coming from a fan. It wasn't coming from media personalities. It wasn't coming from social media outrage. It came from inside the decision-making room. And that changes everything. When someone directly involved in the selection process suggests reconsideration, it validates the doubt that had been circulating externally. It suggests that the original logic may not have fully accounted for momentum. It implies that evaluation isn't static, that circumstances evolved quickly. But here's what made it even more striking. Cheryl Reeve did not walk it back. There was no public reconsideration, no softened tone, no hint of second-guessing. The message remained firm. The roster was constructed the right way. The focus stayed on the players who were there. On the surface, that's leadership. You don't undermine your own team mid-tournament. But the contrast between Staley's openness and Reeve's rigidity highlighted something deeper. A divide in philosophy. Because Staley's comment felt adaptive. It acknowledged that basketball doesn't exist in a vacuum. That momentum matters. That the landscape can shift quickly. Reeve's stance felt rooted, controlled, unmoved. Neither approach is inherently wrong. But when paired with the NBC deal and the swelling market numbers, the optics became complicated. It started to look like two branches of leadership responding differently to the same phenomenon. One branch appeared willing to evolve. The other appeared committed to holding the line. And in an era where public opinion moves rapidly, flexibility often feels more aligned with growth than defiance. The walkback, subtle as it was, gave fans something they hadn't received before: internal acknowledgement. Up until that point, criticism was easy to dismiss as emotional overreaction. But once a selection committee member suggested reconsideration, the narrative gained legitimacy. It wasn't just fans screaming into comment sections anymore. It was a crack in the foundation. And cracks, even small ones, change perception. Because if the decision was airtight, there would be no need for reconsideration language. If chemistry was unquestionably the superior path, there wouldn't be post-hoc reflection. Staley didn't condemn the decision. She didn't admit wrongdoing. But she opened a door. And once that door opened, the debate intensified. Why the shift now? What changed between roster selection and mid-season evaluation? The answer was obvious to most observers. Performance. Attention. Momentum. Clark didn't fade after the snub. She escalated. The numbers kept climbing. The crowds kept showing up. The highlight reels kept circulating. The phenomenon didn't stall. It accelerated, which made the original "not yet" messaging feel increasingly disconnected from reality. And when leadership appears disconnected, confidence erodes. Because fans don't just want dominance on the court. They want alignment off it. They want to believe that decision-makers understand the moment the sport is in. Staley's comment suggested awareness of that moment. Reeve's silence suggested commitment to principle. The tension between those two responses deepened the storyline. Now it wasn't just old guard versus new wave. It was flexibility versus rigidity, adaptation versus control, acknowledgement versus defiance. And in sports, perception of stubbornness can linger longer than the results of a single tournament. Team USA still won. The gold medal still shines. But the conversation didn't close. Because once reconsideration is mentioned, hindsight becomes unavoidable. Every time Clark delivers another standout performance, the question resurfaces. Would it have worked? Would the spectacle have elevated the tournament even further? Would global viewership have spiked even higher? Those hypothetical questions gain power when someone inside the process admits the possibility of an alternate outcome. That's what changed everything. It shifted the narrative from "fans are upset" to "even insiders see the complexity." And complexity keeps stories alive. It prevents clean resolution. It ensures that every future matchup, every press conference, every roster conversation carries subtext. Because once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. It sits there, waiting for the next moment to reappear. And with a $2.2 billion media deal amplifying every storyline, those moments won't stay small for long. There's a scoreboard people don't talk about during press conferences. It's not hanging above the rim. It doesn't show points, rebounds, or assists. It shows viewers. And that scoreboard has been flashing something impossible to ignore. While Team USA was dominating internationally, something else was happening domestically. Regular season Indiana Fever games were pulling numbers that felt disproportionate. Random Tuesday matchups were generating engagement levels that used to be reserved for championship scenarios. That's not normal. That's not incremental growth. That's surge behavior. The kind of surge networks obsess over. Because here's how billion-dollar media negotiations actually work. Executives don't invest based on emotion. They invest based on trajectory. They examine audience spikes. They analyze demographic expansion. They track engagement retention curves. They measure whether new viewers come back the following week. And Clark's games weren't just spiking. They were sustaining. That's what changes valuation. When NBC committed to the league's future, they weren't paying for nostalgia. They weren't paying for polite appreciation. They were paying for acceleration. For upward movement. For the sense that this product is no longer niche, it's expanding. And the clearest acceleration variable in the league right now has been Clark. That's not a dismissal of other stars. Aya Wilson is dominant. Breanna Stewart is elite. The Olympic roster is stacked with Hall of Fame-level talent. But dominance alone doesn't always equal growth. Growth requires new eyes. Clark brought new eyes. You could see it in ticket demand data. In social media crossover from college basketball fans who had never tuned into the WNBA before. In search trends. In highlight clip circulation. The Fever became appointment viewing. That's rare. And when Olympic ratings were compared to regular season Fever games, even if the Olympics performed well overall, the cultural energy felt different. The Olympics were expected to win. Clark games felt unpredictable. And unpredictability drives curiosity. Curiosity drives viewership. That's the cycle networks chase. So when fans started posting side-by-side ratings comparisons online, the narrative hardened. How is the most watched player domestically not included in the international showcase? Again, this doesn't diminish the Olympic team's success. It highlights the attention gap. Because attention is currency. And NBC just invested billions in attention. The disconnect becomes sharper when you consider one more factor: advertising value. When a game draws viewers outside the traditional fan base, advertisers notice. When demographics expand into younger audiences, into casual viewers, into markets that weren't previously engaged, ad rates adjust. Clark's games weren't just increasing raw viewership. They were broadening the audience profile. That's long-term growth. That's why executives care. And that's why fans began framing the Olympic decision not just as a basketball debate, but as a business contradiction. Because the business scoreboard suggested one thing. The roster scoreboard suggested another. One said she's driving expansion. The other said she's not essential. Those two messages struggle to coexist. The ratings reality doesn't make the Olympic team less talented. It makes the exclusion feel economically misaligned. That's what keeps resurfacing in conversations. Because when the league celebrates a $2.2 billion deal, fans immediately ask, what made that number possible? Was it slow, steady, predictable growth? Or was it the sudden surge in attention around one transformative rookie season? Even if the media negotiations began years prior, the surge strengthened leverage. It created confidence. It made the league feel hotter, more culturally relevant, more urgent. Momentum affects valuation. And momentum has a face right now. That's why the market feels like it delivered its own verdict. The market says this is the centerpiece of the current era. The committee said she wasn't top 12 for this moment. One of those assessments appears future-focused. The other appears tradition-focused. And in a growth phase, future-focused decisions tend to resonate more with new audiences. The ratings scoreboard doesn't lie. It doesn't care about hierarchy. It doesn't reward seniority. It rewards engagement. And engagement is what NBC purchased. That's why this storyline refuses to fade. Because every time Clark's team plays, the numbers refresh. Every time engagement spikes, the contradiction sharpens. Every time social media trends around her performances, the Olympic debate reactivates. The financial reality is simple. Networks invest where attention concentrates. Right now, attention concentrates heavily around Clark. That doesn't diminish the greatness of established stars. But it does redefine leverage. And leverage shifts power dynamics. The ratings reality isn't emotional. It's measurable. And measurable data tends to outlast philosophical arguments. That's why this section of the story might be the most uncomfortable for leadership. Because you can debate chemistry. You can debate experience. You can debate roles. But you can't debate sustained viewership growth. The numbers speak without commentary. And they've been speaking loudly all season. That's what makes this more than just a sports controversy. It's a market correction in real time. And markets rarely whisper when they correct something. They move decisively. And they move toward attention. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets said out loud. It's uncomfortable. It's human. And it doesn't fit neatly into press conference answers. Success changes dynamics. Not gradually. Immediately. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, she didn't just change ticket demand. She changed how the league felt. Security details increased. Travel conversations intensified. Charter flight debates resurfaced with urgency. Media requests multiplied. Endorsement dollars surged. And when one player's presence accelerates improvements league-wide, gratitude and tension can coexist at the same time. That's the part no one likes to talk about. Because imagine being a veteran who spent years flying commercial, grinding overseas in the off-season, building the foundation brick by brick, and suddenly a rookie enters with a Nike deal worth millions and an entourage-level spotlight. It doesn't make you resentful, but it does make you aware. Aware that timing matters. Aware that attention isn't always evenly distributed. Aware that the sport is being reshaped in real time. That reshaping affects locker rooms. Media questions shift. Instead of asking about defensive adjustments or playoff positioning, reporters ask about Clark's impact, her fan base, her influence, her comparisons to historical greats. Even during Olympic press conferences, questions circled back to her absence. That creates fatigue. Because players who earned their status through decades of excellence don't want their gold medal runs framed around someone who isn't even on the roster. But that's what happened. And that's where the emotional tension intensified. It wasn't just about roster spots anymore. It was about spotlight distribution. Clark's presence, even in absence, dominated the narrative. And narratives influence perception. Some whispers started circulating. Was there concern about distraction? Was there worry that cameras would constantly cut to the rookie on the bench? Was there fear that coverage would pivot from the veterans to the phenomenon? It's not crazy to think that distraction factored into the decision. Coaches value focus. They value cohesion. They value minimizing noise. Clark doesn't minimize noise. She amplifies it. Every game she plays becomes a storyline. Every turnover becomes a debate. Every 30-point performance becomes a trending topic. If you're preparing for the Olympics, the last thing you might want is an additional media storm swirling around your roster. But here's the irony. By excluding her, they created a larger storm. Instead of cameras cutting to her on the bench, cameras focused on the question of why she wasn't there at all. Instead of distraction inside the team, distraction hovered outside it. Every highlight was accompanied by commentary about absence. Every victory interview carried a shadow question. That's what makes this situation paradoxical. The attempt to reduce noise amplified it. Because in the social media era, absence is louder than presence. And when fans feel like their voice isn't being acknowledged, they don't disengage quietly. They push harder. Comment sections flooded with, "No Clark, no watch." Some of it trolling. Some of it genuine boycott sentiment. That sentiment may not represent the majority of viewers, but it represents a growing segment. New fans who entered the sport because of one player. And when new customers feel dismissed, loyalty weakens. This is the gatekeeping dilemma. The league's veterans deserve respect. They deserve acknowledgement for what they built. But growth phases require expansion of the tent. If new fans feel unwelcome or condescended to for not knowing decades of history, they don't suddenly study up. They drift. And NBC didn't invest billions expecting drift. They invested expecting retention. That's why the locker room undercurrent matters. Because tension doesn't have to be overt to exist. It can be subtle. Body language in interviews. Tone shifts in responses. Frustration when the same name keeps surfacing. Players aren't villains. They're competitors. And competitors protect their space. But the market doesn't protect space. It expands it. Clark represents expansion. That expansion inevitably pressures established hierarchies. Not because she demands it, but because attention flows toward novelty. And novelty is powerful currency. If the concern was that the Olympic roster would become the Caitlin Clark show featuring Team USA, then the exclusion strategy backfired spectacularly. Because the Olympics became the "Why isn't Caitlin Clark here?" show instead. Every absence creates narrative vacuum. And vacuums get filled quickly. That's the dynamic no one can control anymore. The locker room may value quiet dominance. The market values conversation. And right now, conversation orbits Clark. Even when she's not physically present. That's what makes this more than a coaching debate. It's psychological. It's structural. It's about how rapidly fame shifts within a professional ecosystem. Veterans earned their status the long way. Clark arrived with momentum pre-installed. That contrast is bound to create friction. Not necessarily hostility, but discomfort. And discomfort in sports leadership often manifests as conservatism. Play it safe. Maintain order. Avoid chaos. But chaos is sometimes what fuels the next growth phase. And the more leadership appears to resist that chaos, the more fans interpret it as fear instead of strategy. Whether that interpretation is fair or not almost doesn't matter anymore. Because perception shapes loyalty. And loyalty shapes viewership. And viewership shapes billion-dollar deals. That's the chain reaction unfolding in real time. The locker room may never publicly admit tension. They don't have to. The atmosphere speaks through reactions. Through tone. Through silence. And when silence meets acceleration, the story doesn't shrink. It grows. And that growth is exactly what NBC just bet on. The goal may have been to avoid a distraction. What actually happened was the opposite. Once the Olympic Games tipped off, the basketball was excellent. Team USA executed. The defense suffocated opponents. The offense flowed through proven veterans. The gold medal path looked as dominant as ever. But the conversation never stayed on the court for long. Because every press conference carried the same undertone. Every post-game analysis circled back to the same absence. Why isn't Caitlin Clark here? That question followed the team from arena to arena. It appeared in comment sections. It surfaced during halftime panels. It showed up in interviews when players clearly wanted to focus on their own performances. And that's the irony no one could fully escape. The attempt to eliminate distraction didn't remove it. It magnified it. Because when fans believe a storyline was suppressed, they amplify it themselves. Instead of cameras cutting to Clark sitting at the end of the bench, the cameras cut to analysts debating her omission. Instead of media outlets focusing solely on game breakdowns, they ran side-by-side segments comparing Olympic highlights to her WNBA performances back home. The shadow became larger than the presence ever would have been. And it wasn't subtle. Social media timelines turned into battlegrounds. Every Team USA graphic was met with waves of, "No Clark, no watch." Some viewers followed through. Some tuned in anyway. But the sentiment spread. New fans who entered the sport during Clark's college run felt disconnected from the Olympic roster. They felt like the player who brought them into the league wasn't being embraced at the highest stage. Whether that feeling was justified or emotional didn't matter. It was real. And real emotions drive engagement decisions. The Olympics should have been a unified celebration of dominance. Instead, it became a split narrative. Victory on the court. Debate off it. Even when Team USA secured wins convincingly, highlight packages were often followed by panel discussions about who wasn't in uniform. That's not something you can script away. Because absence generates curiosity. And curiosity fuels coverage. The players felt it too. In multiple press settings, frustration became visible. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just tired. Tired of being asked about someone not on the roster. Tired of deflecting. Tired of repeating the same diplomatic answers. You could sense the irritation beneath the professionalism. And that's understandable. They trained for this moment. They earned their spots. They won their games. Yet the narrative kept drifting. That's what happens when cultural momentum is larger than institutional control. The committee likely believed that once games began and victories stacked up, the debate would fade. Historically, winning silences criticism. This time, it didn't. Because winning was expected. What fans wanted wasn't confirmation of dominance. It was participation in the cultural moment. And the cultural moment revolved around Clark. That's what leadership underestimated. They viewed the Olympics as a basketball competition. Fans viewed it as a showcase of the sport's current peak interest. Those are different lenses. From a coaching perspective, the mission was clear: assemble the most reliable group to secure gold. From a market perspective, the mission felt broader: present the sport at its most compelling to a global audience. When those two missions diverge, tension surfaces. The circus they tried to avoid became unavoidable because narrative doesn't pause during tournaments. It accelerates. Every Clark highlight back in the WNBA felt like commentary on the Olympic roster. Every deep three. Every high-assist game. Every sold-out arena clip circulating online added fuel. The debate became self-sustaining. You couldn't scroll without seeing side-by-side comparisons. You couldn't watch without hearing analysts revisit the decision. The Olympic team won. But the conversation never let the story close. And that's what makes this moment unique. Usually, championships erase controversy. This one preserved it. Because the controversy wasn't about outcome. It was about alignment. About whether the league's most electric force should have been visible on its biggest stage. The exclusion turned into a symbol. A symbol of hierarchy. A symbol of tradition. A symbol of resistance to rapid change. Whether that symbolism was fair is almost irrelevant now. It stuck. And once symbolism sticks, every future decision carries its weight. The circus doesn't vanish when the medals are handed out. It lingers in fan memory. It reappears in highlight threads. It resurfaces in every matchup between Clark's team and Olympic veterans. Because the absence became a story in itself. And stories are powerful. They don't require physical presence. They require emotional investment. Clark's fan base is emotionally invested. That investment didn't disappear during the Olympics. It intensified. The committee aimed to contain chaos. Instead, they created a storyline that expanded beyond their control. That's the new reality of sports in the digital era. You can manage rosters. You can manage rotations. You cannot manage narrative momentum once it escapes. And narrative momentum is exactly what NBC just invested in. Which makes this circus more than temporary noise. It's a preview of the tension between control and cultural acceleration. And that tension isn't going anywhere. Olympic tournaments end. Medals are awarded. Confetti falls. But some decisions don't expire when the clock hits 0. They linger. And this one is going to linger for 4 full years. Because now every matchup carries context. Every time Caitlin Clark faces a team coached by Cheryl Reeve, the storyline writes itself. Every time she drops 30 points. Every time she threads 15 assists. Every time she hits a logo 3 in a nationally televised game, the internet will ask the same question. Still not ready? That question won't disappear quietly. It will follow press conferences. It will resurface during All-Star weekends. It will trend during playoff series. Because once a selection becomes symbolic, it stops being about the original criteria. It becomes about legacy. And legacy debates stretch longer than tournaments. Reeve is an accomplished coach. Championships. Defensive mastery. System discipline. Her resume is secure. But in modern sports culture, resume doesn't shield you from scrutiny. If Clark continues ascending, if the ratings remain high, if the arenas stay full, if the media deals expand, the Olympic omission becomes a permanent footnote attached to this era. Not as a scandal, but as a defining fork in the road. One path leaned into structure. The other leaned into spectacle. Right now, spectacle is winning the attention war. That doesn't mean structure loses basketball games. But attention determines cultural gravity. And cultural gravity determines long-term leverage. The next Olympic cycle is already casting a shadow over the present. Because if Clark continues performing at this trajectory, her inclusion in 2028 becomes not just probable, but inevitable. Which means the 2024 decision will forever be framed as the year the sport hesitated. That's the ghost. The what if. What if the most electric young star in women's basketball had been on that global stage during the height of her surge? Would viewership have spiked even higher? Would international fans have connected faster? Would the league's cultural breakthrough have accelerated further? Those questions don't have measurable answers. But they carry weight. And weight influences perception. Meanwhile, the business side of the league keeps moving forward. The NBC partnership signals expansion. More exposure. More primetime windows. More storytelling opportunities. And every one of those storytelling opportunities will center around star power. Because that's what networks sell. They don't sell systems. They sell personalities. They sell rivalries. They sell moments. Clark is a moment machine. That's not hyperbole. It's pattern recognition. The friction between basketball governance and market acceleration is now visible. And visibility creates pressure. Pressure on leadership to align messaging. Pressure on coaching philosophy to adapt. Pressure on veterans to embrace the growth wave rather than brace against it. The fans are watching closely. Not with hostility, but with expectation. Because this feels like a crossroads for the sport. Will the old guard adjust to the speed of change? Or will they continue managing it cautiously, risking further perception gaps? The irony is that collaboration would benefit everyone. Clark feeding Aya Wilson in transition would elevate highlights for both. Clark spacing the floor for Breanna Stewart would create easier scoring lanes. Spectacle and structure don't have to compete. They can coexist. But coexistence requires acknowledgement of momentum. And momentum right now is undeniable. The Olympic Committee may not have been run over on the court. They secured gold. But in the court of public opinion, the debate didn't tilt in their favor. Because fans measure more than trophies. They measure alignment. They measure whether the league feels unified. They measure whether leadership understands where the energy is flowing. Right now, energy flows toward Clark. That doesn't diminish the legends. It contextualizes the era. And eras eventually define legacies. When we look back at this stretch in WNBA history, it won't just be remembered for a gold medal or a media rights deal. It will be remembered as the moment when the market made its preference clear. The market chose acceleration. Leadership chose caution. One of those approaches will shape the future more decisively. And that's why this story isn't fading. It's evolving. Because every Clark performance adds another chapter. Every ratings spike adds another layer. Every new fan joining the conversation reinforces the shift. This isn't about disrespect. It's about transition. And transitions are rarely smooth. They're messy. They're debated. They're resisted. Until they become undeniable. The NBC deal is undeniable. The growth surge is undeniable. Clark's influence is undeniable. The only remaining question is how quickly governance catches up to momentum. Because momentum doesn't wait 4 years. It compounds. And when it compounds, it rewrites power structures quietly. The 4-year ghost will hover until the next Olympic roster is announced. But by then, the sport may look entirely different. More global, more profitable, more culturally relevant, and possibly more unified, if leadership chooses alignment over resistance. Or more divided, if the philosophical gap widens. That's the crossroads. That's the tension. That's the billion-dollar contradiction still echoing through women's basketball. And it's not finished writing itself. Here's the reality no one can ignore anymore. The market has spoken. The fans have spoken. The numbers have spoken. When a league signs a $2.2 billion deal during the exact season a rookie is driving record engagement, that's not coincidence. That's momentum crystallizing into valuation. You cannot separate the financial leap from the cultural surge that preceded it. And that's why the Olympic omission feels larger than 12 roster spots. It symbolized hesitation at a moment that demanded acceleration. It signaled caution during a period of explosive growth. But here's the truth most people miss. Power shifts don't happen in press conferences. They happen in data. They happen in viewership spikes. They happen in packed arenas. They happen when new fans refuse to disengage. The Olympic Committee made a decision. The market made a different one. And markets rarely lose long-term. As the WNBA enters its new broadcast era with NBC, every storyline will be amplified. Every rivalry will carry subtext. Every performance will be evaluated not just for wins and losses, but for influence. Clark isn't just a player anymore. She's leverage. And leverage changes negotiations. It changes exposure. It changes the tone of the entire league. The old guard built the foundation. That deserves respect. But the new wave is filling the seats. That deserves recognition. The smartest path forward isn't resistance. It's integration. Embrace the star. Elevate the veterans. Unify the narrative. Because division in a niche sport is expensive. Unity in a growth phase is priceless. The billion-dollar contradiction revealed something important. The shift has already happened. The only question left is whether leadership fully acknowledges it. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think the Olympic Committee made the right call? Or did the market prove them wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything. Let's turn this into a real discussion. And if you enjoy deep breakdowns like this, not just headlines, but the strategy behind them, make sure you subscribe. This channel is still growing, and every single subscription helps push this kind of analysis into the algorithm. Hit that like button if you want more high-level breakdowns of the power shifts happening in sports right now. It tells the platform this conversation matters. We're building something here, thoughtful, data-driven, and unfiltered. Don't just watch the shift. Be part of it.